A couple of years ago, we refinanced our house, and when we did that, it was around the end of the year, which meant it was around property tax time. So we put enough for the property taxes in escrow, but we also received a bill for our property taxes, and so we paid the bill. And then once everything was going with the refinanced mortgage, they were showing that they paid the taxes out from the escrow account as well. And I thought, well, I've got the documentation. This is going to be an easy process to fix. I just send a copy of the receipt, a copy of the check to the title company, and send it to the people who handled all the closing, and everything will be fine, and they'll get me our money refunded. This will take probably about a week, and everybody will get on with their lives, and everything will be fantastic. And that is not at all what transpired. 4 months later, I was still waiting for the issue to be fully resolved. And that's when I finally decided and started to contact state agencies that handle these things. And lo and behold, the same day that I contacted the agency, I got a call from somebody at the closing company who ignored 3 of my other inquiries up to that point, and now they were right on it. And within a week, everything was finally refunded. Now, I thought this was going to be an easy process. I thought this was going to just be something that as soon as you show the documentation of, everything is going to be solved rather easily. And what I found out in the process is I am not a patient person. And what I found out in the process is, lo and behold, all of a sudden when those emails were going to their spam folder, if you get somebody else involved, they can magically find them and then fix everything rather quickly. And what I discovered is sometimes our expectations in life determine how we feel about certain situations. And because I thought this is going to be something that is easily remedied, and it's going to be something that is solved rather quickly, I grew more and more annoyed the longer that it took. And I don't know if you've ever found yourself in a situation or a circumstance like that where you feel you're in a situation that shouldn't take that long to be resolved, or you're in a circumstance that you feel like you're going to be done with rather quickly, and all of a sudden things don't go the way that you envisioned, but it's a frustrating place to be. And I can't help but think Joseph had to be experiencing some frustration as he was in prison. And that's the backdrop that we're going to look at today. If you have your phones or your tablets, I'd invite you to follow along with us this morning in the Bible app. It's a free resource that you can find in whatever app store you utilize on your device. And if you search in Bible, there are going to be a number that pop up. You're looking for the Bible app that's either produced by YouVersion or Life Church. It's the same entity, and go ahead and install that on your device. And one of the features within that Bible app is the events feature. Either enable your locations or write in Lakeside, Algoma once you're in the events feature of the Bible app, and we'll pop up and you can follow along with us that way. If you have a traditional Bible with you this morning, we're in the Old Testament book of Genesis, the very first book in the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 40. If you're joining us via the stream this morning, thanks so much for joining us. My name's Brian, and I'm part of the team here at Lakeside, and the verses will be available for you on the screen below. Now, before we dive into Genesis chapter 40, just want to recap, just want to catch you up on where we've been over the course of the last few weeks. We've looked at the life of Joseph, and Joseph was a remarkable young man. He came from a family that was messed up. It was a blended family. His father was a polygamist, multiple wives, multiple children, and he let all of his children know that Joseph was his favorite. And Joseph took that to heart, and his brothers didn't like it very much, and so they decided, hey, let's kill him. And then cooler heads prevailed, and they decided if we kill him, we don't really benefit all that much other than just getting him out of our lives. But what if instead of killing him, we sold him into slavery? Then we get him out of our lives, and we profit from it. So that's what they decided to do. They sold Joseph into slavery. He was taken away from his home, taken into a foreign land, into Egypt. Now that's where Genesis 37 ends. Then Genesis chapter 38, it takes the spotlight off of Joseph for a chapter and puts the spotlight onto Judah, one of his brothers. And it details for us how Judah's life spun into chaos, and he lost multiple children. ended up having an inappropriate relationship with his daughter-in-law. She became pregnant, gave birth to twins, messed up family dynamics, continued. Then we go back to Genesis 39. The spotlight is shown back on Joseph, and there in Egypt, he is bought by a man named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar is a high-ranking official in Egypt, and God is still with Joseph, and God is blessing Joseph, and Potiphar recognizes that God is blessing Joseph, so he puts him in charge of every aspect of his household, and Joseph has essentially free reign. And while this is happening, Potiphar's wife notices Joseph, and she propositions him and says, I want to have a sexual encounter with you. And Joseph does the right thing, and he resists her, and she does not relent. She continues to approach him, ultimately one day grabs him by the clothes, and he runs out of the house. She holds on to them, alleges that he tried to rape her, tells her husband that. He is upset, understandably, and so he has Joseph thrown into prison. And that's how Genesis 39 ends. And now we arrive at Genesis chapter 40. Beginning in verse 1, we read these words. Some time after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. Now, before we go any further, I want us to recognize how Genesis 40 verse 1 starts and how verse 4 ends. Sometime after this. Sometime after this. Meaning, Joseph was not in prison for a day or even a week. This is a long stretch of time where Joseph is in prison. Now, don't forget, he's innocent. This isn't something that he actually did. He has been maligned. He has been lied about. He has been abandoned, and there he is in prison. And I don't know about you, but if I'm God, I'm making this situation right away. And if I'm Joseph, I am certainly wanting God to make this situation right away. This is injustice. This is wrong. These are the moments where you wonder, God, what are you doing? This isn't an instantaneous, God rights everything that is wrong, circumstance and situation. An innocent man continues to be in prison. And it's not a short stay. And sometimes, in certain scenarios, in certain situations, we are wronged. Sometimes in certain situations, in certain scenarios, something happens that goes against God's standard, that goes against God's will, and we cry out to Him and we ask, God, would you fix this? And sometimes God does, instantly. And yet more often than that, God is not beholden to our time frame. God doesn't act at the speed which we wish He would act. And that's certainly the case here if we're Joseph. That Joseph remains in prison. And it's not a short time. Now, while Joseph is stuck in prison, the chief cupbearer, and understand the role of a chief cupbearer, it was essentially Secret Service work. He would be the last person before the king had the food or the drink, so he would drink the wine, he would eat the food to make sure that nobody was poisoning it. As long as there have been governments, there have been people that want to overthrow them, there have been people that want to assassinate leaders. And so the role of the cupbearer would be to drink the cup to make sure that it wasn't poison. Because if it was poison, then he would die and the king would not die. To make sure that the food wasn't poison. Because if it was poison, then he would show the signs and the king wouldn't get it. A very high-ranking role. A lot of trust is involved in that capacity. So that's the first individual that we're introduced to. And then the second is the chief baker, another high-ranking official, somebody who's entrusted to make the food of the king, to make what the king wants to eat. It is their job to produce that food. Now, both of these high-ranking officials, they anger the king, they are thrown into prison, and Joseph, who was blessed in Potiphar's house by God, is still blessed by God here. God is still pouring out his favor on Joseph, which is fascinating because I think to most of us we would say, well, if God was pouring out his favor on Joseph, then he would be out of prison. And yet that's not what happens. That God's plan is different. And so even though Joseph is still confined, even though he is still in prison, God is still showing him favor, which means we have to wrap our minds around the fact that sometimes God blesses us in situations and circumstances that we don't want to be part of. That's what's happening here. But God is still blessing Joseph. So much so that he is now in charge of these other prisoners who are high-ranking officials. And again, their stint in prison for some time. This is not a short stay in prison. And there is Joseph day in and day out being stuck in a situation, being stuck in a circumstance that he would not choose. And one night, they both dreamed. The cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" So the cupbearer and the baker, they both have dreams. They both have dreams. And Joseph saw that they were troubled. And this is no small thing. Don't miss out on this. This is no small thing that Joseph realizes that the cupbearer and the baker are troubled. Remember the context. Joseph is in prison, and they're in prison with a couple other prisoners. He sees that they are troubled by something, and he displays empathy. He is empathetic towards them in what they are experiencing, which means even in his own suffering, he's able to see beyond it and see the suffering of others. Now, I don't know about your vision of prison. I know from some of my experiences in prison, and if you're like, what? I've done some prison ministry, all right? So everybody take a deep breath. The only reason I've been there. But I don't know what your vision of prison is. But generally, my experience has been, it's not a place where there's a lot of empathy. Not a lot of empathy from the guards towards the prisoners. Not a lot of empathy from the prisoners towards the prisoners. It's just really not a place where everybody's sitting around feeling sorry and having a lot of sympathy for all of the circumstances and situations that everybody else is facing and experiencing. And yet what we see from Joseph is here is someone who has unjustly been accused, who has been maligned, who has been forgotten, and here he is in prison with everybody believing the lies, everybody thinking they know the truth. Sitting in prison as a condemned man, he sees two other people who are troubled, and he still cares. And this is a call for all of us who love and follow Jesus. that even if we're in the midst of our own suffering, we need to see beyond. And as we come together collectively as a church of people who are committed to loving and following Jesus and loving others as ourselves, this is absolutely an essential ingredient to that, to living the life and living in the community that God has called us to live and be a part of. That we rejoice with those who rejoice and we suffer with those who suffer. So that every person who walks in these doors and every person who encounters Lakeside knows first and foremost and ultimately that they are loved by God. And second, that they are loved and they matter to us. This is the community that God has called us to be. This is the collective that we must be. And we must see others in their suffering. And every person must know that they don't have to walk through that situation and those circumstances and their suffering alone. This is the community that we are called to be. That Joseph not only saw that they were suffering, he cared enough to engage them even in the midst of his own suffering. And they said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." Now Joseph seizes this opportunity because he cared enough to go over and encounter them, and now he engages them, and he uses this opportunity to shine light on God and be used by God. When he says, "Do not interpretations belong to God, tell them to me," he's not putting himself equal with God. He's not saying, "Well, interpretations belong to God, so tell me because I'm God." What he's saying is he harkens back to what God has already done in his story that we saw in Genesis 37. God has already supernaturally communicated things to Joseph through a set of dreams. And so he says, "Hey, this is not me who's able to do this, but it ultimately is God." So he seizes the opportunity to shine light on God and be used by God. And regardless of where we are, in our situations and our circumstances, we should do the same. That we should use the opportunities that we have to shine light on God and be used by God. In the same way that Joseph did here. So the chief cupbearer told his dreams to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer." So the chief cupbearer, he has a dream. He shares the dream with Joseph. He says, "Hey, there were these vines and there was these grapes and Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph says, "Here's the interpretation. Here it is. You're going to be restored to your role. You are going to be restored to your role. You're going to have your old position back. You're going to be out of prison, and everything is going to go well for you. This is what's going to happen in your situation and in your circumstance." Joseph interprets what his role would be, and that he would be restored to his role. And then Joseph continues, "Only remember me when it is well with you. And please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh. And so get me out of this house, for I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. And here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." So Joseph pleads with the cupbearer and says, everything is going to go well for you. 3 days from now, you're going to be restored. And when you are, do me this kindness. Do me a favor. When you're restored to your old role, remember me. Here's my story. I'm innocent. I didn't do these things. And not only that, but my brothers sold me into slavery. I was taken into another land. But please, remember me when you are restored. What he's asking the cupbearer to do is use your platform and use your position to help others. Use your platform and use your position to help others. And this is what we all should do. As people that love and follow Jesus, we should be on the front lines of using the platforms that God has given us, using the places that God has positioned us, and using our roles and our positions to help others, to benefit them. Over the course of the last week and a half, people in our country in the southern region are suffering. There are massive complications. Hundreds of people dead. Places that will forever be altered as a result of the hurricane and its aftermath. This week, one of my brother-in-laws was an engineer, but he went and he took licenses, went and took tests and got his licenses, and recently became a pilot. And so this week he went and he rented an airplane and he filled it up with supplies and did 4 flights total into regions that have just been shut down as a result of roads that are inhabitable in places that could not get the goods that they need. Hundreds of other pilots did the same. Thousands of people came and donated goods and donated things that they could. And as an aside, I just want to remind you, this is who we are as a country. Don't lose sight of that over the course of the next month. When everybody's telling you be team red or team blue, don't lose sight of who we actually are. This is who we actually are. Now, I am not able to fly a plane. You don't want me to try to pilot a plane. I assure you. But I'm able to provide supplies. And this is a beautiful picture of thousands of people coming together to do what they can do, to tangibly help people. And this frequently happens in our country when there's a disaster. But as people that love and follow Jesus, the call for us is that this shouldn't be dependent upon a disaster. This should be the way we live our lives, day in and day out. That we leverage our positions. We leverage our resources to help people. And that's what Joseph is asking for here. It says, when you have the opportunity, when you are with Pharaoh, tell him my story. I've helped you. I've served you. Don't forget about me when things are good for you. Now, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head. And in the uppermost basket, there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree. And the birds will eat the flesh from you. I mean, talk about a shift. Can you imagine? You're the baker. You're eavesdropping. You're hearing what's going on with the cupbearer. You're wait a minute. We were arrested at the same time. We were in prison the same time. Joseph just told him in 3 days you're going to be restored. Hey, I had a dream too. Well, what was your dream? Well, I had this bread and I had it on my head and there were these birds. And Joseph says, oh, well, here's your interpretation. Pharaoh's going to execute you. That went a little different. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Pharaoh releases and restores the cupbearer, just as Joseph said would happen. And he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph said would happen. I don't know why this scenario. I don't know why it happened like this. I know that impulsive actions have always been done by rulers. It's nothing new, but whatever the case may be, the cupbearer is restored. The baker is not. And then we get to verse 23. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And Joseph is forgotten. Now here's the thing about forgetting. Sometimes it's not that big a deal. This week at dinner one night, one of our sons said, "Hey, we need to go to the store. We need to go buy some headphones." We're like, "All right, why?" And he said, "Well, my teacher said I need headphones." My wife was very puzzled, and she said, "Well, what about the headphones that we sent to school with you on the first day of school that were part of your supply list that we made sure that you had?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, I've never taken those." And my wife, asking more questions, said, "We're a month into school. What have you been doing for a month?" He says, "Oh, I just turned the volume up really loud and put my ear right by the speaker, and then I can hear some of it. But my teacher said I really need headphones." And then my wife starts panicking. Like she wants to send an email to the superintendent explaining that we actually have headphones for our child and that we're not deadbeat parents. And I'm like, "Why are you worried about it? Just send his headphones with him to school." She's like, "Is he actually going to take them? Because he already didn't take them to school with him." I'm like, this really isn't that big of a deal. Sometimes forgetting isn't all that important. You forget a birthday. You forget to thaw some food for dinner. You can recover from that. It's not that bad. Sometimes forgetting has more implications. You forget to pay your speeding ticket. You forget about your anniversary. These things are a little more complicated. Sometimes it's devastating. You find out who your friends are when you're in the valley. And the people you thought you could count on, who are suddenly too busy to pick up the phone and text you back. The people that you were always quick to drop everything and go help, who you can no longer get a hold of. The people who promised would love you forever, only to be gone. The wound that's still present in your life because of the parent who never cared. Or the child whose picture smiling you still have on the wall in the hallway of your house, and every time you walk past the picture, it's a reminder that smiling kid, someone you don't even recognize anymore, and has cut you out of their life, and they never even explained why. That's when being forgotten really matters. And the call for us as a community is that every person who walks in these doors and every person who encounters Lakeside knows that they are loved and they are valued by God, and knows that they are loved and they matter to us. That every person who walks in would recognize that they don't walk through life alone, that they aren't isolated. And does that mean that being part of a community is going to magically fix the wounds of a father who never cared about you, or a child who's abandoned you, or a love who promised you forever only to walk away? No. There's no way we could fix those wounds. But it is a promise that at your lowest, when you are suffering the most, that you aren't alone. That we are a community of people that even though we suffer, we see beyond our own circumstances and we see the suffering of someone else. We rejoice with those who rejoice. And we suffer with those who suffer. And every person who's part of this collective community would know that they are not alone. God, I pray that you would help us be just that. That in the good times, our celebrations together would be fantastic. When life gets its hardest, that no one would feel they have to be alone. I pray for the person right now who feels forgotten. Who feels alone. And I pray, God, supernaturally, your Spirit would communicate just how much they matter, just how valuable they are. And I pray that we as a collective community would lean into one another's stories. So that every person who encounters Lakeside would know that they are loved by you and they are loved by us. God, help us leverage the positions and the platforms that you've given us. I pray for the person who's stuck in a scenario they don't want to be in right now. I pray they wouldn't lose heart. God, let us love one another in the ways you've called us to love. Work through us, Jesus, for your glory, we ask in